Thank you so much for being here. It is wonderful to see everyone wherever you are in the world. You probably haven't heard, but in America there is an election that is coming up next week. I know this might be a little surprising to some who aren't newspaper readers because newspapers aren't as successful as they used to be. But there is an election next week, and that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the 2024 election, reflections on the Jewish vote from a professor who has been a friend and partner to VBM and has taught for us a few times in person and virtually just a few weeks ago. And if you go to our learning library on the VBM website, you'll find his past recordings. We're thrilled today to be with our great partner, Temple Emmanuel in Denver. Temple Emmanuel, our great partner, and my dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Emily Hyatt. And I'm going to pass it over to her to introduce our scholar today.
Thank you, Rabbi Shmuley, and hi to everyone. I'm so glad that you are joining us today. I will tell you, this is an extra special VBM class for a couple of minutes. Number one, as mentioned, it does seem particularly timely. I'm sure that that was intentional on the part of all of the people who make the schedule for VBM. But oh my gosh, I'm really looking forward to a little bit of like grounding and learning, because the conversations that are happening around us feel a little chaotic right now. There's a lot of information and a lot of stress and a lot of pressure floating around. And for those of you in Denver with me, you know that we also are filling out like the longest ballot in history. It was so many pages. And so there's felt a lot of stress around it, more than just that top question, but all of the so many other questions. But more excitingly, I'm so excited to introduce all of you to Dr. Stephen Windmueller, who is one of my very favorite professors from rabbinical school. And I had the opportunity to learn with him over the years that I was studying at the Hebrew Union College in LA. And Dr. Windmueller brings, I have a bio that I can read, but I'm sure you can find it online. One of my favorite things about Dr. Windmueller is that he has this combination of experience working in the Jewish community in a whole lot of different nonprofit settings, studying the Jewish community in the years after he was working in all of those nonprofit settings, and he has this sort of canny ability to zoom out and to understand what are the dynamics and the dimensions of the different pieces of the Jewish community that interact with each other. And the first time I learned with him, he really taught us about different Jewish organizations and their life cycles and how they interacted with each other. But to hear him talk not just about the organizational Jewish community, but the Jewish community psyche and how that impacts us, and how that impacts certainly a moment like this, when we're in this unbelievably hard year, more than a year now, and when we're faced with this enormous sort of world-changing election. And what does that mean for us as Jews? And knowing that all of his experience and his wisdom and his perspective on this particular moment and reflections on this vote, and this vote from a Jewish lens, I think is I'm hoping, no pressure, Dr. Windmueller, but I'm really looking forward to what I know will be a grounding conversation that gives us a framework and a perspective for just how to think about the landscape of the Jewish community and how everybody's feeling at this moment. Dr. Windmueller, you have always been one of my very favorite teachers and professors and thinkers, and I look forward to learning from you every time. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you. And thank you so much, all of you, for being here.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Hyatt, and to Rabbi Shmuley. Rabbi Hyatt and I have another point of connection, which is very meaningful to both of us, which is BBYO, but that's for another day. And indeed, the topic for today is indeed our conversation about the 2024 election. And Alex, why don't we bring up the PowerPoint and let's begin this discussion. No question that American Jews, and for that matter, American society, is at a tipping point in terms of this critical moment in the history of this republic. So let's explore more deeply what all of this may mean for both us and for the larger context of American democracy. Let's move to the next slide. I just think it's important we remind ourselves that we represent a relatively small portion, obviously, of the overall American population, roughly 2.3%. But by contrast, we are extraordinarily committed, involved, and active as donors, givers, participants within the American political and social process. And as such, American Jews certainly push way beyond their 2% capacity as impacting American society. We generally live, that is 75% of us, in 8 core states, representing 188 electoral votes, of which only Pennsylvania is in play at this election. And I think we will note that further as we speak about those Jews living in what we call those swing or critical states. No doubt American Jews come to this election with multiple agendas, but certainly the considerations of our special and unique relationship with Israel is a dominant theme in 2024. And I would also point out that we are the oldest white ethnic voter base in and amongst American religious and cultural and ethnic groups. And over 20% of us are over 65. A more direct comparison would be to take a look at Florida, where 42% of the Jewish community represents voters and participants over that age, compared to the state's average of only 20%, just reminding us that we are of a particular generation of voters and activists. Let's move to the next slide. Jews have a core contract with America. That is, we are bound by much that has tied us together since we have been here since the very beginning. That contract includes such principles as the First Amendment, Article 6 of the Constitution, which speaks that there shall be no religious tests. It is demonstrated in a variety of very special experiences that Jews have enjoyed with various presidents, with the Congress, and with a host of other aspects of American political life and society. We represent all different perspectives and certainly are reflected in all of the parties that contribute to the American democratic story, including what we would call as third parties. Jews are great contributors to politics, and no better example of that is this 118th Congress, the current Congress, where 27 members of the House are Jewish, and what we would note is 38 Jews have served over the course of these many years in the United States Senate, and 215 Jews have been elected to the House of Representatives. Currently, we remind ourselves that there are 10 United States Jewish senators currently in service. Over these many years, since 1916 in particular, we have seen 8 justices from our community appointed to the Supreme Court. So this deep embodiment within the American political process is part of that contractual connection that brings Jews to democracy and to the American story. Let's move to the next slide. There have been numerous commentaries about Jewish political activism. One such comment is here, politics as the religion of American Jews. And indeed, many folks believe that in so many different ways, Jews are articulating their passions, both their religious and American ideas and connections through their political choices. Others have noted that Jews are more pro-choice than pro-Israel. That may have been true prior to October 7th, but we see a lot of factors today that blend and change some of those perspectives. In 1968, a sociologist by the name of Milton Himmelfarb suggested Jews live like Episcopalians, but vote like Puerto Ricans, suggesting that there was a kind of a baseline of what would be expected of Jews to become something else. But in fact, we have remained historically tied to the roots of our politics. But ideas do matter to the Jewish community. And Jewish voting does change and is changing, as we will observe in a few moments. And I should point out that there is a critical tie over the history of American politics to third parties and Jewish involvement with those. And again, we will see some of that in the next few moments. Let's go to the next slide. I think we want to take a look at American politics in a more particular way. I would point out to you that between 1864 and 1900, Jews were overwhelmingly Republican. Lincoln was an abiding force within the Jewish community's psyche and connections. Lincoln would be buried on Passover in 1865, and American Jews would be deeply tied to his story, to his efforts to save and preserve the Union, and would remain close to the Republican Party over those 40 years that concluded the 19th century. Here in the 20th and now 21st century, we would see a different set of voting patterns, as the Jewish community itself would change from 1880 till 1920. We would see the rise of Eastern European Jews coming in large numbers that would shift American politics and American Jewish thought into the Democratic ranks, but also into socialist thought. We would see candidates running as third-party contenders who would receive significant Jewish support. And one of those examples is the 1948 election involving Dewey and Truman, but also Henry Wallace. Notice that Wallace receives 15% of the Jewish vote, reminding us of the deep ties that Jews have to the socialist and world of Eastern Europe, of which they brought their political agendas and their social contracts. We note throughout this period of the heavy emphasis of Jews, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt and moving through this particular era, of being predominantly Democratic voters in the second half of the 20th century. Let's go to the next slide. In 1980, political scientists were struck by the factor of this election. First of all, it is Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan, and it involves a third-party candidate, John Anderson, a member of Congress from Illinois. Notice that Anderson, again, a third-party candidate, draws a significant percentage of Jewish voters, but there's a very different reason for that. First of all, Carter is seen as an outlier amongst Democratic previous candidates. He is seen as challenging on Israel, problematic on Iran, and as a result receives a lower percentage of voter support, 45%. Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, gets the highest response and support amongst Jewish voters for a Republican candidate in the second half of the 20th century, 39%. But political scientists are struggling with the fact that that would decline in Reagan's second term in 1984, where he would receive 31%. But we would note that the rise of the moral majority between 1980 and 1984 would play a significant role in moving Jews away from Reagan, fearful of the rise of Christian influence and the meshing of religion and politics in an American context, resulting in this loss of 8 percentage points by President Reagan in that second election. If we look at the last two categories here, 2008 and 12, we're looking at Barack Obama's two campaigns. And again, we're often asked, why did President Obama lose support in his second run for the presidency? And again, here, we're informed by the fact that women in America, Latinos, and African Americans all reduced their support in the second term of Barack Obama. So this follows a pattern of reduced support across the board amongst numerous voting groups. Let's go to our next slide. In looking at the last several elections, we would remind ourselves of Hillary Clinton's campaign with Donald Trump winning the 2016 election. Trump would receive 24% of the Jewish vote, but we would then note that in 2020, that number would increase by some 6 percentage points. And this is based on the average of several polls that we have from Pew Foundation, the Associated Press, and from various other sources. But it reminds us that voters do move, and that movement, while potentially less significant, is suggesting a particular trend. And I want to move on that trend to show you in the next slide what that may look like. Let's go to the following slide. Here we see a Pew study from just a few months ago suggesting that Donald Trump will get somewhere closer to 35% of the Jewish vote, yet another degree of increase. Political analysts suggest that number could be actually higher, and others have argued it will be potentially lower. But the point is, there is no question that the events of the past year have created a kind of level of anxiety among many Jewish voters, creating a more likely and potential outcome that would suggest a tighter connection between the Republican support that Jews will render than has previously been identified. Vice President Harris is less well known to many Jewish audiences, and as a result, that contributes to her numbers being less robust, if you wish, than previous Democratic nominees. One of the more interesting components of this election is Gen Zs. These are 18 to 35-year-old voters, and amongst Jews, they are tending to register as independents. This has not been a characteristic of the Jewish community. Jews tend to vote by party, very loyal to their respective parties, and yet we see a new generation of voters likely to show a kind of different outcome. This will also be an election that will affirm the continued growth and impact of Orthodox Jewish voting and the presence of Orthodox voters in many key parts of the country. And we're looking at specific congressional districts where that pattern is likely to play out. As I had earlier described, the 7 states in play, which I describe as the Bagel Belt, represent Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Associated with each of those states is the percentage of Jewish voters in those states. And we are specifically watching Pennsylvania, and certainly to a greater or lesser degree, several of these other contests, because we believe in Pennsylvania we will have 300,000 Jewish voters. And that will be a very clear signal as to the shifts that we're likely to see in this election, having to do with any shifts in Jewish political practice and behavior. Likewise, Nevada, with Las Vegas having a significant Jewish population, Arizona with Greater Phoenix being very important. We are again watching those numbers with a degree of interest. Let's go to the next slide. I think it's important to remind ourselves that both on the Democratic and Republican side, we see very distinctive types or characteristics of Jewish voting behavior. Amongst Republicans, we identify the first group as identity voters. Identity politics voters really ask the question, is it good for their community or their constituency? And in the case of Jewish Republican identity voters, this is very much about Israel. It is about the fight against anti-Semitism. It deals with national security. And these voters historically have tended to be folks who have come to the United States more recently from such countries as Iran, Israel, and Russia. A second group of voters, smaller in number but very significant in historic value, are neoconservatives. These are the remnants of the 1970s element within the Republican Jewish ranks who proposed an alternative conservative ideology to the existing views that were prevalent in that era. And the neoconservatives are a voice that would be very significant during the period of Ronald Reagan's presidency and that of both of the Bush presidencies. It is important to remind ourselves that that is a smaller constituency as we look at ideological conservatives who are homegrown Republicans from the Midwest and the South who adapt to the ideas, the politics, and the views of their neighbors and tend to be traditionally conservative around economic and social issues and tend to find their home as historically based in the Republican Party. Religious values conservatives are, for the most part, American Orthodox voters, although not only that constituency. They tend to align with evangelicals and other religiously traditional-based community voters in the mindset that America needs to be re-anchored in sets of values that reflect religious tradition, and the celebration of religion in the public arena is something that affords them this opportunity to be major voices and players within American political discourse. And the fifth and final category are never Trump Republicans, those folks who have broken with the party around the Trump presidency, beginning in 2016 and continuing over these past number of years. We will be interested to see whether they return to the Republican camp this year or remain outside of it in light of the Trump candidacy. Let's go to the next slide. Likewise with American Jewish Democrats, there is a set of different factors here than from the Republicans, because liberalism is the defining stream that brings many Jews to the Democratic Party. Part of that is a connection between their Americanism and their Judaism. They are linked between liberal political values and the various principles associated with Tikkun Olam, the repairing of the world, and this meshing of both American Judaism and American democracy is a powerful motif for them. But this moves on a continuum with different ideas taking importance or relevance at given time periods. Abortion is particularly significant at this time, but in the past, other issues have dominated the liberal agenda and have been profoundly important in impacting Jewish votes. There are Jewish Democrats who come to the party from a perspective of a particular issue, whether it's gun control, or whether it deals with climate change, or whether it reflects any number of other issues that Jewish Democrats find particularly significant in their own political thinking. The third category here are red diaper babies. This represents the great-grandchildren and in some cases the grandchildren of Jewish progressives. They account for about 7% of Jewish Democrats. Certainly we see the dominance here of the left wing of the Democratic Party influencing this particular constituency. And these voters have historically found their home in this particular camp of both socialist ideas and now what I guess we would call democratic progressive practice. Let's go to the next slide. The political campaigns that we are living with and observing are driven by particular ideologies. We may not hear a lot about them at times, but they are primarily the drivers, the constructs around which these campaigns are built. And certainly both the GOP, the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party have adapted to various ideas. Currently, I would suggest there are three within the Republican Party: national conservatism. And I think here we need to make a very clear distinction. This is not Ronald Reagan's conservatism. This is what we are seeing in Hungary, in France, in Poland, and other parts of Europe. It is an expression of a conservatism that begins with nationalism, that is very focused on militarism, highly developed around the idea of monoculturalism. It is distinctive in the sense that it differs from traditional conservative ideas from the point of view of both finance, foreign policy, and economic affairs. The second principal ideology in the Republican Party today is populism, and this is Donald Trump's specific contribution here. Trump fully embraces what Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Huey Long fully understood, which is that if you tap into the grievances, the pain, the anger, and the disconnect of your populations, you, in a sense, afford them a voice or vehicle for national recognition and expression. And that has been a powerful piece to the Trump candidacy and his presidency. Christian nationalism is the third of these political ideologies. It is an offshoot of evangelical political and religious behavior. It is specifically committed to the notion that America is a Christian nation. And it is based on the idea that this nation has been graced by God and ought to reflect in its policies and practices the Christian values and Christian outcomes that are called for by its supporters. Traditional democratic liberalism in its various shades drives the Democratic Party as the contrasting perspective. And certainly, as we've noted earlier, the progressive wing with its more defined post-modernist agenda is challenging that traditional modality or model of democratic liberalism. I should remind ourselves that postmodernism has a number of components to it. And as we move through these slides, I will be focusing on what some of that may mean for the Jewish community and the Jewish vote as we look more deeply at it. Let's go to the next slide. I think there are challenges that are facing the Jewish community, and I'm going to mention three here, because I see something evolving in this election that is profoundly challenging to the Jewish community. The question, are Jews white people? And how do we get to that question? The far right and the far left offer us two different, very challenging explanations. What we saw in Charlottesville in 2017, the phrase, Jews will not replace us, was a crafting of a set of ideas by groups such as the Proud Boys and others, who have argued that Jews were seeking and are seeking to replace the white Anglo-Saxon establishment of power with their own supporters and their own allies, and that Jews were seeking to become white. So that is the process by which they assume power and their whiteness is affirmed. The far left, on the other hand, has said the Jews are already white. Why? Because we have, quote, given up our minority status and position, and we have affirmed or assumed a whiteness. We have become powerful. We have become dominant, and we are defined as colonialists, racists, Zionists, and as such, we are seen by the far left and the postmodernist philosophers and philosophies as a group that now is to be contended with, to be challenged. And as such, we are marginalized by the left and seen as part of the white establishment. A second phenomenon in this election is the loss of trust in American democracy. Now, this is not a phenomenon that occurs in 2024. It begins in 1970. And political scientists tell us that over these 50 years, we have seen an extraordinary loss on the part of Americans of trust in the political instruments of government, the presidency, the White House, the Congress, and the Supreme Court as examples. This trust factor is profoundly important to democracy. When people say it's no longer working, it's no longer viable, that is very challenging to a community that it's itself very deeply committed to democracy, very involved in this process, as Jews are. So this is a real challenge to the Jewish community because we are seen as stakeholders in the democracy, and our opponents view it as problematic at this moment. And the third characteristic, which I think is going to be important in 2024, is the apathy factor. Yes, I know that in 2020, we turned out 66% of American voters, the largest turnout we have had for more than 120 years. But the reality of that vote was an anomaly, and we may not see that again in 2024. And this apathy factor is profoundly important because it ties to the trust issue, and it ties to other considerations that Americans have lost faith in and do not believe their votes make a difference in the outcomes of this kind of contest and election. So these factors we need to keep into account as we examine what may happen on the 5th of November. Let's move to the next slide, please. I know you can't read this, and I don't do this for an eye test, but I just wanted to point out to you that we monitor rather carefully where Jews are located. So here we have, by state, each of the core population bases of the Jewish community and their percentages, simply to remind us that Jews are very concentrated in specific parts of the country and in particular states in a more direct way. Let's go to the next slide. Here is something that I think will have significance in a few days from now, because we're going to be watching, for example, the top 5 to 8 of these congressional districts. New York's 12th, it's 9th, California's 32nd. By the way, I live in that district. New York's 10th and 17th. And the 17th, by the way, is Westchester, North Westchester, and Southern Rockland County. And that's a high density of Orthodox Jewish voters. So we're going to be watching that in particular. We will also be watching Florida's 22nd and Florida's 23rd, precisely again because of very high density of voters, including significant numbers of Orthodox Jewish participants. And as we see here, the larger the number of Jewish players, it gives us a much better sense of our polling data and our analysis as to the character or the substance of the Jewish vote. So we are likely to have polling done in Florida, New Jersey, New York, and California of Jewish voters to get a sampling in much more density-based Jewish districts as the ones I've just described and others. Let's move to the next slide. This is fascinating because this is a fairly new phenomenon. This is produced by the Jewish Electoral Institute, a nonpartisan group looking at polling data on Jewish political behavior. But in this particular study done this past spring, they asked voters to indicate the issues, the concerns that voters had that would drive their votes in 2024. The first item is for the first time on this chart, the future of democracy, where 46% of American Jews indicate that this is the deciding or influencing factor in their thinking about the American political scene. We would have expected, and here note, that abortion scores very high for Jews. And Israel scores 4th here at 25% of Jewish voters say it is significant. And one has to understand that historically, in the past 30 years, Israel not at war has meant that that number would be very much reduced and very much part of a lower category of priority. Whereas in this particular context, it has become rather significant. Likewise, we note that inflation and the economy, as with all Americans, has become a much more dominant theme. What is striking to many analysts is the low numbers we see here for healthcare, Social Security, and Medicare. Why? Because Jews are older. And as older voters, this becomes a particularly critical issue in terms of their well-being. And often we see those numbers, even for Jewish audiences, as ranking in the 3rd or 4th percentile is of importance. What we note here, climate change, which receives 14% or of consideration, is primarily an agenda that younger American Jews have ranked and rate as much higher than other issues often on these kinds of charts. So this is a really interesting insight into how at least a panel of some 1,250 Jewish Americans who were surveyed for this particular study perceive the agendas before us. Let's go to the next slide. I think these are pretty obvious that we do know Americans and by party candidates appeal to particular issues, and the R&D simply referencing the likelihood that Democrats relate to those particular issues and Republicans to the others that are identified here. Let's move to the next slide. I think for American Jews, there are many factors, certainly in this particular election, and no doubt the first of these, Israel, anti-Semitism, and the politics of hate, are of a considerable concern in light of the events that we are all experiencing both here and certainly within Israel. But there are new demographics that we also need to contend with. I'm going to point to 3 or 4 of them just to introduce this topic. We are seeing a significant movement of Jews, and this has occurred since COVID and as part of the post-COVID experience in this country. Jews leaving metropolitan New York to move to Florida, Jews leaving the Bay Area of California to move to Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. We have some data to suggest other movements of Jews in some significant numbers out of larger metropolitan areas into other kinds of settings that will potentially have a longer-term impact on voting behaviors. Another issue of particular interest is the Jewish vote changing? What we are detecting is that as the Jewish community becomes more assimilated, now the 4th generation of American Jews, and in some cases even 5th generation of American Jews, we begin to see many more changes in voting as the impact of assimilation into marriage and other factors contribute to the likelihood of a vote that will appear differently over time, even raising the question of will there be a Jewish vote in the context of traditional practice and patterns of where Jews live and the sense of community and the sense of identity. And as that identity and community dissipate to some degree, we are challenged in a sense to remain or retain this idea that there may not be a Jewish vote moving forward. Jewish political homelessness is an interesting theme as well, because many Jews in surveys are telling us their uncertainties of where they belong politically. Less today about the candidates per se, and more about the sort of the state of American politics in a more general context. So all of this is reshaping or likely to reshape over time the Jewish picture in America, coupled with the fact that other communities are becoming increasingly larger, more significantly involved politically, leading to one conclusion here for sure, that by the mid-century, by 2050, Muslim Americans will replace Jewish Americans as the 3rd major religious constituency in the United States. Let's go to the next slide. So this is simply a reminder that this is the plan, this is the outline as provided by the Constitution and is provided and set by the Congress of the United States in terms of the steps that will take us to the swearing in of a president next January. And I put it here only to remind us that assuming we have an easy and realistic transition of power, that this will be the accepted pattern, and hopefully that law and responsibility will prevail in the weeks and months to follow. Let's move to the next slide. Many American Jews raise with me the question of really 3 principles. What about the turnout this year, which I am deeply concerned about, as I've already noted to you with regard to what we now have as early projections. We have a much smaller number of Americans turning out with early voting. We see this in this 50 million votes have been cast as of yesterday. And what we are noting is that we have lower numbers in Pennsylvania and Nevada in particular in terms of those outcomes. and that portends for a lower overall projection of voters. The integrity of the vote, that is the vote going to be correct and honest and judged with a clear point of preserving the integrity of the ballot? And we would assume so, and every effort is being made to protect the voter and the vote. And for sure, that is key to creating a sense of credibility and integrity about this election. But we do not know is this third factor, the day after and beyond, and hopes that Americans will accept the outcomes, and there will be, as I suggested earlier, a clear transition of power. Democracy is on this ballot in so many different ways, and I look forward now to your questions and to welcome the opportunity to hear your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Windmueller. That was so fascinating. We would love to open it up to questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hands and we can call on people to unmute, and you can also write things in the chat as well. Judy, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Dr. Windmueller, what is the argument that or what is the reality of Trump being better for Israel rather than the Democrats? I don't understand that.
Okay. I think that the argument that Republicans are making in this case is that the track record of Donald Trump during his tenure as president from 2016 to 2020 resulted in the Abrahamic Accords, resulted in the United States moving its embassy to Jerusalem, resulted in the support given by the United States for Israel to incorporate the Golan Heights as part of Israel territory and state status, and to other initiatives that the administration had given that demonstrated this particular loyalty or connection and support for Israel's security and integrity. So, I mean, that is the frame I think that the Republican perspective has given to this question. So for voters who look at the issue of who's going to be best for Israel, that will be how the Republican response would be most likely portrayed.
Thank you. Did you have a follow-up question?
Well, but Trump has also said that he's also fought with Bibi. I think it's a very mixed picture. It's not that simple at all.
Yes, no, obviously. I was providing to you a kind of one-off on the positive side, but clearly we know as well that there are questions that both sides have with regard to the candidates' sort of either record or the clarity of that record. And surely Trump and Israel's prime minister have had a more complex relationship since President Trump left the White House, and a more mixed bag of behaviors and responses to Israel in the past several years. In my book on Trump and his impact on American Jews in Israel, I invited a number of scholars, some Republican and some Democrats, to describe and discuss Trump's sort of behaviors and his positions. And my Israeli colleagues here in this volume note that it was a much more complicated and complex set of relationships with Israel than is often sort of just portrayed in terms of political rhetoric or campaign rhetoric. So your question, is more complex, Judy, than just simply, the affirmation of what the former president delivered. It's also about relationships and the challenging nature of some of those relationships. Yeah.
Thank you. There was a question from Lois in the chat, which was, is it known if Jews participated in the January 6th event?
Yes, there were some who did, and several that I know were arrested, actually. So yes, there is some evidence to that reality.
Thank you. A couple more in the chat. One was, is there any real benefit of Trump having moved the embassy to Jerusalem?
What's interesting, I think the initial reaction was that this would create an uproar in the Arab world and would be difficult for the United States in terms of some of its relationships elsewhere in the Middle East. But we did not really detect that specifically to be a problem. So I don't know that we have really any correlation between that decision and any behaviors or actions that were seen as difficult or problematic for the United States, at least.
Thank you. The next question was, is there a relationship between Trump's support for Israel, as you articulated, and Trump's support of Putin?
Well, that's fascinating. Obviously, because at the moment, as we know, the Russian involvement with Iran on various fronts, militarily, economically, in particular, and more directly, the Russian involvement with the issues in Yemen, which certainly are challenging to the United States because of the efforts by terrorist groups in Yemen to intercede with shipping moving through parts of the area. This is challenging, and it's likewise challenging to Israel in light of the fact that Israel at this point is, of course, contending with Iran and its proxies throughout the region. And we see the behavior at the United Nations of Russia in terms of not being particularly supportive of any initiative to back Israel or support the United States in efforts to hold accountable either Hamas or Hezbollah. So we do note that this is a more radicalized position by Russia, probably all tied, of course, to its own needs and situations involving the Ukraine. My sense is that the former president believes he can, on the day one, end the Ukrainian war. I think that may be an unrealistic assumption or belief on his part, because we are seeing a real shift today in realignments of nations, North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia, in a kind of coalition that we have not monitored or seen in an earlier time. And that changes the Trump equation in terms of his ability to sort of, quote, have influence.
Thank you. Dr. Heydrich, I see your hand is raised.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Windmueller, for this morning. Just the history of the Jewish vote in the United States was very enlightening, I think, and probably a sign of our times that it can't be depended on as a 95% block, but that there's a lot of fracturing within the Jewish vote. So that to me was fascinating. I see, however, in the Trump-Harris contest that Judy brought up, Christian nationalism in its foundation is antithetical to the survival of Judaism, not only in the United States, but worldwide. The rapture won't come until everyone is a Christian. So I see that, I mean, that is Trump's 2025 and his mandate for administration. That alone would switch me from voting for him. There's a booklet that the Democratic Majority for Israel, the DMFI, put out that I've just nearly memorized, and it's Kamala Harris's 20-year record of pro-Israel statements and actions. Not only does she, as a candidate, support the movement of the embassy and the Abraham Accords, But she goes beyond that and says that her administration will strengthen and build on that. She's always been against any arms embargo to Israel, and certainly has been very vocal about the demands of what we see a lot of the violence and anti-Semitism in the United States focused on a unilateral ceasefire, that Israel should ceasefire and not Hamas or Hezbollah. Can you give us some, just maybe go, and I don't want to embarrass you or force you into something that doesn't feel good, but could you give us maybe a personal interpretation of where you think the administrations are headed, both Trump and Harris? And I really support your idea that there has been a breakdown of trust in the government, and I think that's the basis of a lot of our indecisions and people not knowing what to do.
Well, thank you, Dr. Heydrich. Yes, Vice President Harris has an interesting and rather long record in relationship to Jews and to Israel. Her first trip to Israel was actually when she was just starting out politically. She went through to Israel through the Jewish Community Relations Committee of San Francisco. She's had an abiding connection with the pro-Israel community in the Bay Area, and now increasingly here in Southern California with a number of players. And that's often, by the way, not sort of referenced in much of her work or her publicity. My sense of the administrations of the two candidates is that we are likely to see the Biden type of connections to Israel, because as you know, Joe Biden has had a long history of ties both personally and professionally with Israeli politicians and Israeli players, including the prime minister. And even with disagreements with the prime minister, there has been this rather extraordinary, extensive relationship, and likely the vice president will carry that forward. I don't know, of course, whether, depending again on the kind of outcomes we see if in the Congress, because it will be difficult for either candidate if the Congress is either not of their party or split, for us to see some major changes or actions on both domestic and foreign policy considerations, especially matters related to financing any new initiatives. So all of this is triggered and tied to the congressional races as much as it is to who wins the White House. I mean, no doubt the former president, Donald Trump, will likely maintain much of what he was trying to accomplish in his first run to grow the Abrahamic Accords, which, by the way, as you heard from Dr. Heydrich, that's also on the agenda of the vice president, and to likely to be more assertive in at least with Iran, and that may be one of the distinguishing differences between the two candidates, is sort of how they will embrace or handle U.S.-Iranian connections over time. And that's an unclear picture, at least on my part, in terms of the Harris administration. It's a bit more defined based on Donald Trump's previous behaviors and likely decisions. You raised in your comments the interesting insights about Christian nationalism. And I would point out to you that I think that religious value Jews, that is, Jews who are aligned with Christian nationalism principles of making the country more religious and more actively, publicly religious, worry less about the end goal of certainly the conversion of American Jews, or the ending of the state of Israel and the rapture of the second coming. My sense is that their political endgame is much more in line with the value structures of Christian nationalism, which is to generate a society tied to religious values and also tied very practically to issues such as school choice and vouchers, which for American Orthodox Jews is a powerful and important motif. And we need to understand that in light of the fact that they have large families, have a significant interest in Jewish education, and are deeply committed, as we know, to growing this kind of connection of the sort of the religion in the public square. But thank you for your thoughts and your question.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions in the chat. I'll try to get to as many as we can. I'm going to go to the question that Rabbi Shmuley wrote because it's sort of on a topic we didn't talk as much about yet. Why does polling seem impossible now? Polling experts seem to now be able to get away with saying it can be a tie or that either party can win with a blowout, and they still are held to be experts. Are they failing, or has something shifted demographically?
That's a great question. And Rabbi Shmuley, we are all reminded by 2016's campaign, where we really misread, where pollsters totally misread sort of the mindset of the American public. And there we learned several things, that we were not asking either the right questions, and at times we were asking questions where audiences were not prepared to tell us the total truths, their bottom lines. The other reality is that in 2020, while we had the outcome correct, we missed by a great deal on the actual numerical count. In other words, pollsters were saying Joe Biden would win by 5 points or better. He won by far less than that, closer to 2.5 percentage points. And so we need to understand that polling has certainly been criticized and critiqued, and I assure you that the polling firms are fully aware of their missed opportunities and misreadings of some of these findings, which then leaves open the question in 2024, are we in for a potential surprise or a misread of what all of this is telling us? And obviously we will not know that outcome until maybe several days after Tuesday. But there is a serious challenge here about how effective our polling results really are. And part of that has been that the American public is somewhat changed. Folks are distrustful of polls. They're distrustful of the pollsters, and in some cases very uncomfortable revealing their political choices. So all of that has led to a much more difficult and certainly a credibility issue for the polling industry, which has, by the way, generated a lot of new polling outlets as well. So if you go to 538 polling, you'll see huge numbers of polls being generated on this election with all kinds of outcomes, and which can make you go crazy because you have to make a choice. Well, how do you know that the methodology of this poll was solid and viable and scientific? And who's behind this poll? Is it a particular candidate, or is it a party, or is it a cause that wants to sort of convince you that there's only one way forward? So one has to be particularly careful about reading the polls and saying this poll is telling us the bottom line realities, when in fact we know that we have to take the best polls, put them together, and create what we have is today a kind of consensus reading of these results. So yes, you could see a Wall Street Journal poll which is projecting a Trump victory, and then you can turn around and look at a ABC or CNN poll, and it shows you a much more a contested outcome. So my suggestion here on polling is do not believe in any one poll, and take a look at the collective set of polls to draw any conclusions. In the end, they may all have misread the American mindset at this moment, which could well be what we will be living with after Tuesday.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. I apologize that we don't have time for more questions. I'm sure we could talk about this at length for a lot longer. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Dr. Windmueller again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to learn with you. And thank you to Temple Emmanuel for co-sponsoring today's program. And thank you so much for being with us today.